in a sort of unintentional way, I think Donald Trump ends up being a motivator for the clean energy transition, the green transition in the 21st century. The conflict that we see around traded energy, which means oil and gas, is motivating a security-driven acceleration in clean energy investment and the restructuring of an energy supply chain in Europe, but not just in Europe, around the world.
Well, James, thank you for coming on the podcast. It's quite an interesting timing to have that conversation. Today, we will talk about geopolitics and its impact on the energy transition. And on this podcast, I'm usually going at the micro level with startups and VCs and innovation, but today it's more of the macro discussion with you. But before we get into this, would you mind introducing yourself and the work you do?
Sure. First off, thank you very much for including me, Hugo. I'm delighted to be here. I've been a longtime fan of your podcast, and it's really an honor to be included. I am a strategist. I currently work for the Carlyle Group, but I have about 30 years in the commodities and energy space, um, and I've done a variety of things. So I was a commodities risk manager for Ford Motor Company. I ran the metals research for Goldman Sachs. I ran a hedge fund. I did a lot of these different things. So what it means is that I got a chance to sort of see how the commodity markets work from the buy side, from the sell side, corporate, financial, taking risk, writing about things, sort of touched all the different bases. And what I'm doing right now is much more about distilling a lot of that experience into perspectives on how, the geopolitics and the geoeconomics are affecting not just the markets, but the energy transition, which is I don't need to tell you how essential that is right now. And that's turned into some publications that I think have managed to get some conversations moving forward. So that's a little bit about what I've been doing and where I am at the moment.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Quite an amazing career in the space, obviously. Look, so obviously, on this podcast, we talk about transition, climate technologies, where we stand, and trying to bring a bit of optimism. Let's see if we can get some optimism today. But let's first start with a bit of context. Um, you suggested to have this conversation with a very specific timing in mind. What is the context for today's conversation from a geopolitics perspective?
Well, the context is it's sort of extraordinary, actually. There has been a stream of events that has been kind of unfolding in front of us now for actually decades, and this is something that I wrote about 2 years ago, and have followed up since with my colleague Jeff Curry over at the Carlyle Group, and I think it's important to set that context before we start diving into the current stuff that's going on in Iran. And the context is really important. So, you know, the United States has been sort of the hegemonic guarantor of a world energy and financial and security infrastructure, and that's been absolutely critical. When the United States feels a change in the environment, the United States' incentives change and its behavior changes. Most recently, what we've seen is that the U.S. became energy independent. And when that happened, the American incentives to protect global sea lanes and to protect the global trade in oil and gas sort of evaporated. And this is really, really important for the clean energy space, for the clean tech space. If you think back to the last time we had these oil shocks of this magnitude, if you go back to the 1970s, the Arab oil embargo in 1973, followed up with the Iran crisis in 79, that was the sort of motivating force in the United States for Project Independence, where Richard Nixon sort of accelerated investment in nuclear and in renewables in an efficiency drive. So, in a way that maybe nobody would have predicted, Richard Nixon was kind of like the midwife for a clean energy movement in the United States, but it was predicated on a security imperative, not on any I think environmental imperative. So take that as an example of what happens when this change in an oil balance of trade affects the American, set of incentives. So apply that template to where we are now. We're no longer dependent on imported oil, which means that the U.S. no longer feels like it is sort of obligated to protect the global trade in oil and gas. And that takes you straight to kind of the sequence of events that we have right now in Iran. And this is where it becomes, pretty crucial and critical for clean tech investment, and particularly in Europe. I'm very, very focused on the implications for Europe.
So let's briefly talk about the events. So we are recording on the 19th of March. If anyone is listening later, right, like just to give a bit of context, because we don't know where that's going. So can you tell me just a bit of the sequence of events that happened within the last couple of
Yeah.
months?
Yeah, in fact, it's not just the 19th of March. It's the 19th of March at 9:40 in the morning London time, because things are moving so rapidly. So let's get into that sequence of events. So about 3 weeks ago, the U.S. and Israel started attacking Iran, and it's not really clear to me what the American aims are here, and it's not really my place to talk about good, bad, successful, not, whatever. Um, but one thing is very clear to me, that if the U.S. Was not going to achieve a sort of Venezuelan kind of decapitation and takeover of, the regime, that they envisioned within the first few days, then the Iranian side would be motivated to kind of do something that they'd never seriously done before, which is to press the sort of the oil trade equivalent of the nuclear button and close the Strait of Hormuz. And that's what they did. So for the past 2 weeks, what we've had is this sort of relentless war of attrition, where the Iranians have been, targeting oil infrastructure and the oil trade, and have mostly, but not entirely, closed off the Strait of Hormuz. On the other side, the U.S. and Israel has been sort of pounding Iran, I think with the idea that this was going to get the Iranians to stop. So where we are today is the transit of most oil and gas through the Strait of Hormuz has been effectively curtailed. Now, this is massively important, because it's roughly 20% of global oil production or oil trade consumption, rather, and roughly 20% on LNG as well. And this feeds into the Asian markets. It feeds into the European markets. It does not feed into the U.S. market, but there are sort of consequences down the road. Now, what seems to be happening right now, and this was, again, a forecastable kind of consequence of these actions, is that the Iranians are selectively blocking certain trade and allowing other tankers and carriers to pass through. So there's still about 1 million barrels a day of oil that's transiting the Gulf, but it's doing so in Iranian-flagged tankers, or Chinese, and we've seen some Pakistanis, some Indian vessels passing through. And so, what it looks like the Iranians are doing is, instead of sort of turning on or off the straits, they're basically turning down and up a dial. So that's given Iran, actually, quite a lot of power. Now, what that means for the Europeans is actually quite dramatic, because Europe is extremely dependent on imported oil, gas, and products. This is something that we've talked about. I've talked about over the course of the past couple of years as being sort of a glaring vulnerability for the Europeans.
And that's maybe something important to touch on, because what you say in the report is that despite the fact that we are moving away from fossil fuel, basically oil and gas, in terms of volume, the application of that is more critical than before. In other words, whatever we could move away easily from fossil fuels, we have done because it was easy. But the remaining part, the use cases that you can maybe talk about in a minute, but the use cases that are more difficult to transition away from, those are the one where we are quite dependent. Is that a correct understanding of it?
That's exactly right. And I'm really glad that you sort of moved in that direction, because I think this is where we get to sort of the heart of the matter. So the energy transition, particularly for a place like Europe, has, you know, it's essential for avoiding, this existential crisis that we're facing with global warming. But that is a slightly longer down the road kind of problem. There's a more immediate concern, which has to do with, keeping the lights on in the short term. Wind, solar plus storage, like, this is a phenomenally effective way to replace the joules that are embedded in oil or in gas. Like, this just works. So you build out the grid, you plug in whatever your source of power is, wind, solar, nuclear, geothermal, kind of doesn't matter, because it all feeds into this clearinghouse of electrons. And then those electrons then go out and, they become your transportation fuel for your battery EV, or, they become, the heat for your house and with your heat pump, they feed your industrial economy. Like, everything's like, at that point, you're okay. But in order for that to work, first, you need to have the grid expand, sufficiently to provide that kind of clearinghouse for joules that everybody consumes. Because we don't consume oil and gas, we don't consume the sun, we consume the joules. So that needs to happen. And the second thing is that you need to build out that power infrastructure so that you can maintain that supply of energy on a stable basis. And we're just not there yet. Like, we're halfway there. We're sort of like caught in mid-stride, moving in the right direction, but still very, very vulnerable. So when you get this curtailment of the energy flow out of the Gulf, the obvious sort of first hit is, okay, we just have fewer joules contained in molecules that we get to burn. And, we've made a lot of progress, actually, in insulating ourselves from that effect. Like, high five, like, congratulations. We have rolled out tremendous renewable resource, which is fantastic. The problem is we're not quite there yet. And there are a lot of very specific applications that we're nowhere near being able to replace oil and gas for. So let's take the example of balancing the grid. Molecular storage is a really effective way to balance a grid when you're subject to the intermittency that you face with wind, solar, and inadequate storage. Like, we've made a lot of progress, but we're just not there yet. So you have to have a sort of molecular storage solution here. Natural gas works. Hydrogen's not there yet. If we run out of natural gas, we're going to turn to coal. The last time Germany faced itself, having shut down nuclear and then deciding it needed to switch off imported natural gas from Russia, they went down and dirty. They went straight for lignite, like it was the worst of the worst. But that's what they did to keep the lights on. So you need to have that balancing molecule for the grid. You also need to think about specialty chemicals. You need to think about petchems and plastics, and you need to think about, like, the utility that these molecules provide for very specific applications. And here I'm thinking like jet fuel. So, sustainable aviation fuels like SAF, that's great, but like it's like a pinprick in the entire vast amount of aviation fuel that you need. So you need the jet fuel in order to keep your planes in the air. if you don't have the jet, you get into this like really wicked situation of, having to start rationing and curtailing demand. Um, and it's not about the energy contained in the jet fuel. It's about the actually, the chemical composition here of what you're putting onto the plane.
So if we go back to the situation we're facing today, in my mind, there's one scenario that's clearly drawing out from that, which is you have you have a constraint that's driving innovation, basically, which is if you have less fossil fuel available because of security reasons in that matter, then maybe that's a time when we're going to have to just push all of the buttons on innovation on climate technologies to try and, you know, basically solve for those use cases that we haven't solved so far. And as a result, have just a cleaner energy economy. Is that a good understanding, or could that also be another completely different scenario where we just go back to coal and whatever else?
So I want to talk about the way you first framed it. But first, let's sort of take care of the second way you framed it. No, I don't think we just go back to coal and everything else. I think that is very clearly not feasible, and it's not desirable. And I don't think anybody is like seriously talking about it. Um, I haven't heard anybody seriously talk about like, sort of returning to a fossil fuel economy in the context of this sequence of events that we've been seeing over the past few years. But what I would say is that we need to be pragmatic about what fossil fuels do for us and what we need out of fossil fuels in order to help us to realize that first set of goals. So Europe needs, I'm focusing on Europe, obviously. Europe needs localized energy first. It needs to be secure. That means it doesn't come in from someplace else. At the moment, the only realistic way to import energy is rock liquid gas, right? So, coal, uh, oil, natural gas. So if Europe wants localized energy, then that means, because Europe is not long oil and gas in a meaningful way, that means it needs nuclear. That means it needs renewables, geothermal. That means it needs to push on the innovations that you're talking about. So that's the longer term goal for Europe. In order to get to that longer term goal, Europe needs to make sure that it's not, knocked over on the way by its inability to provide for the oil and gas that it needs for its everyday grid balancing activities, for keeping the jets in the air, for keeping the plastics, coming out the line. That's stuff that we were talking about before. So it probably makes sense, actually, for the Europeans to have another look at unblocking investment in North Sea oil and gas. We haven't weaned ourselves off of oil and gas yet, but we should wean ourselves off of imported oil and gas as quickly as possible. That is a stepping stone. That is something which allows you time to kind of keep the economy humming while you get to the sorts of solutions that you were talking about before. Investing in innovations in order to solve for the plastics that we currently depend upon oil and gas to provide, or to solve for the jet fuel that we currently depend on to keep the airplanes in the air.
Do we have time though? Because, does the climate allow us to have more time?
Um, so yes and no. I mean, you said at the beginning that you wanted to hear something optimistic, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to give you much cause for optimism, because we're sort of running two races. I think the one that's more dramatic in terms of sort of the consequences is the existential threat that we face from climate change, and I got to be honest, I'm gloomy. Uh, I want to tell you that it's going to all be okay. I just don't think it is, and I think we're like now in damage control mode, uh, and we need to, reduce our carbon emissions as much as we can, and accept the fact that it won't be enough to avert climate change, and that we need to just find a way to live with this, which I find, it makes me have a second glass of wine. It makes me sad. It's disturbing. But there's a more immediate problem which we face, which which has to do with, the way human beings are in the world. We are motivated by fear first, greed second, compassion third. It's just who we are. And I don't like it, but it is the reality. And we need to make sure that we can preserve our sovereignty in order to protect our values. So, the Enlightenment values of liberal democratic pluralism are, enshrined right now in Western Europe. And I think that's incredibly important. Like, I think that we need to preserve that, which means that we need to make sure that Europe is energy independent. Now, the beauty of this one is that achieving both of those goals, averting climate change or mitigating at this point the impact of climate change, and achieving that energy independence, they overlap perfectly for Europe. So that is the optimistic take here. Now, to get back to the question about innovation and timing, I think that within Brussels, I spent a lot of time going back and forth with Brussels and to some of the regional, the national capitals, but within sort of the Brussels, conversations, I think there's a great sense of urgency, but there's perhaps not yet a willingness to see the energy infrastructure as a vital national or security interest that needs to be treated in the same way that you would, the defense industry in a time of war. And I don't want to be alarmist here, but the reality is that energy has been weaponized, and Europe has been the target of weaponized energy. So, without any declaration or any sort of clear identity as to who's on which side, Europe needs to behave as if energy in security, resilience, localization is a way of defending itself from a world in which energy is weaponized against Europe. So that means focusing on developing these technologies that we were talking about. I think Europe has, been blessed with, or has created, its own luck with, this remarkable capacity for innovation and technological development. Like, it's just breathtaking how many of these great technologies originate from, within the European research clusters. I mean, I live in the UK. I still consider I'm British as well as American, but I still consider myself European. And I live sort of in between that. I live near Oxford. But that sort of research corridor between Oxford and Cambridge produces, it just spins off so much, useful technology when you're talking about the clean energy transition. I wonder if we need to spend more time now thinking less about brilliant, innovative ideas and more about scaling up a few of those ideas and building the supply chains in order to, quickly, robustly, efficiently deploy these technologies. So stop thinking, oh, this is potentially a first best solution, and start thinking, okay, here's a second best solution that we can activate now and that we can deploy continent-wide or European Union-wide.
And the good thing is that they don't have to be mutually exclusive. You can do these two in parallel. I mean, obviously, in the report that I'll, by the way, put the link into the description of this episode, you mention China, which is one of the obvious one, where you basically say that China's clean energy push is strategic. So basically, the things they're doing on batteries, solar panels, nuclear, this is not because they care about the planet or the environment or having a minimal carbon footprint by any means. According to you, actually, it's just because of security. Can you expand a little bit on that? Because I think that's quite interesting as a thesis for climate innovation.
Yeah, I want to be careful. I don't want to like impute any intent or benign or malevolent on the part of the Chinese, but I can look at their behavior, and China has invested, quite aggressively over the course of the past 15 years, and quite explicitly in technologies which would allow them to electrify and to develop the energy resources which they have. China does not have oil. It does not have gas in anywhere near the kind of scale that they would need in order to have energy sufficiency. China has, repeatedly demonstrated and said that their energy security is a top national priority. So when the Chinese invested in, electric vehicle manufacturers as a way of avoiding a dependence on oil via the ICE, the internal combustion engine, that was a national security imperative. When the Chinese rolled out, nuclear on a scale that, is sort of breathtaking, that was so that they wouldn't have to depend on, imported, energy. When China does develop its own domestic, fossil fuels, it's coal, and they have shown absolutely no reticence to install coal-fired capacity, which would, seem to argue against a commitment to reducing emissions, but is extremely consistent with this, I want localized energy. The coal is dug up inside of China, no problem. The sun is harvested inside of China, no problem. Nuclear can be developed inside of China, no problem. That's sort of the approach. And it's been extremely successful. What I'd like to, if it's a, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
So, because what I wanted to talk about, sort of next, to sort of bring the conversation back to Europe a little bit, is, China for a lot of people in this space, it's sort of, I mean, it is. It's incredibly intimidating. I mean, they're enormous, and they have some of the best technology out there in so many places, and they got there by being really smart and working very hard. For them, we need to look at China with, an enormous amount of respect and appreciation for what they've accomplished. But now let's ask how they got there. The very, very short version is scale. Like, the Chinese have an industrial system where the state is very much involved at certain levels, and it allows for an enormous amount of competition, and then to allow the winners to take advantage of scale that nobody else in the world, can seem to provide. And that is why you have these Chinese technologies and corporates that are able to become so dominant. Now let's compare that with sort of the other side, with the U.S. People like to talk about American exceptionalism and what the U.S. gets right, and how the U.S. has managed to achieve a lot of these technological, wins. But at the end of the day, if you boil it all down, again, it comes down to scale. Like, the U.S., success in so many areas of energy and defense innovation and technology comes down to just being able to sell a lot. So now let's look at Europe. Europe as an economy is larger than either of the two. The population of Europe is larger than the United States. The scale is actually here. The reason why we don't leverage that scale is because we don't talk about Europe, we talk about France. You're in Paris. We talk about Italy. We talk about, the UK, because I still see the Britain as part of Europe. We're talking about Germany or Sweden. But what we need to have is some way to talk about Europe. Now, how do we get there without forcing everybody into, sort of a monolithic United States of Europe that would be antithetical in some ways to those same liberal pluralistic values that I was talking about before, the things that we're trying to defend. And I think that comes through a new approach to industrial policy, sort of a recognition that the state, that the European Union as a supranational organization, has an incredibly important role to play in Europe, in the same way that the Chinese state, via industrial policy, managed the development of Chinese energy infrastructure and the energy economy that leveraged on Chinese scale. And exactly the same way that the United States has applied industrial policy, even though it doesn't like to admit it, over the course of a century in order to allow American corporations to take advantage of innovation and industrial scale in order to become dominant. Now, we can do this in Europe, but we need to do so in a way that allows us to still have 24 independent nations that cooperate, but don't necessarily have to become a single entity. This requires conversation, compromise, negotiation, debate. All of these things that, particularly in America, that people, just love to criticize Europeans for talking, right? And something that quite honestly, I hear a lot, when I'm in Brussels, oh, we talk too much. Oh, we debate too much. That actually is the core value that we need to be protecting. We talk to each other about the best way to roll out a grid enhancing technology. We discuss the best way to develop a power market that will cross over different operators. We negotiate about how we're going to develop a geothermal solution that can achieve the scale that will allow Europe as an entity to achieve these energy goals. And it's messy, and it's exhausting, and it's tiresome. And at the end of the day, everybody walks out not having achieved everything they want. Not getting what you want is what it means for everybody to succeed in this particular case. That's how we need to reframe industrial policy in Europe so that we can become competitive and even move ahead of the Chinese and the Americans on the energy front.
Let's get back to today's conversation, and maybe we will finish this conversation on that, which is my understanding of this discussion so far is that the hierarchy of needs, or the Maslow hierarchy of needs for energy, goes as follows: security, price, and then sustainability, which rings a bell for me when we look at startups and investing in startups, because we always come back to this idea of green premium and the fact that we don't want a green premium anymore. So quite interesting to see it there as well. But so if that's a hierarchy, if security is first, what do we think? What is the conclusion of the current situation with the war in Iran? What does that mean for climate tech innovation? Is that slowing it down, accelerating the innovation, accelerating the transition? Where do you stand?
I think it's really clear, actually, that the security priority means that we accelerate innovation in climate tech. Like, I actually think that's actually really straightforward. So, in the same way that, Richard Nixon sort of became the midwife for the clean energy movement or the energy efficiency drive in the U.S. in the 1970s, in a sort of unintentional way, I think Donald Trump ends up being a motivator for the clean energy transition, the green transition in the 21st century. The conflict that we see around traded energy, which means oil and gas, is motivating a security-driven acceleration in clean energy investment and the restructuring of an energy supply chain in Europe, but not just in Europe, around the world, in order to reduce vulnerability to those kinds of shocks. So from that perspective, I think it is very, very clear.
Well, that was maybe the positive note of that conversation, which is we will find some sort of acceleration. So it's interesting because so far what I believed in was that basically you need to play the rules of capitalism to make technologies that are faster, better, and cheaper in order to replace fossil fuel. That was one of the criteria I looked at. But then you brought another criteria to the conversation, which is national security, or like European security as another driver, which I think is quite fascinating. Look, if people want to learn more about what you're doing, what are some of the reports that you would recommend reading first within your work?
So the reports that I've been referencing, they're all available at the on the website for the Carlyle Group where I'm working at the moment as a strategist. There's one up there called the New Jewel Order, which my colleague Jeff Curry and I wrote almost 2 years ago now, and it really lays out the framework for what we're discussing. There's another that we followed up with, the New Marshall Plan, which looks at the security imperative for Europe. And then there's a third report that we just recently published about 2 weeks ago called A Crude Awakening up there on the website. And that is sort of an update of the New Dual Order in the context of this conflict with Iran.
Fantastic. And the beauty of that is everything is for free. You're very generous with your work, which is fantastic. So I highly recommend people to check it out. It's quite interesting to understand the geopolitics and energy aspect of the world. So thank you so much for sitting down with me, James. It was a pleasure.